Okay, hi everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Johannes Fahrenfort. And I was just talking to him about how he spent all of his career in the Netherlands, which I think is very unusual for an academic. But then he told me that he actually did a postmaster's in human-computer interaction and then spent 9 months in the States working on that. So he did not only spend his whole career in the Netherlands, but he did his PhD with Victor Lamme and Steven Scholte at the University of Amsterdam. And after that, he went on to do postdocs with Professor Ridderinghoff and Professor van Linden, also in Amsterdam. And after that, he got a position at University of Utrecht for 2 years after taking up a post at the Cognitive Psychology Department of the Free University of Amsterdam, where he's now co-PI of the Consciousness Brain Lab. Johannes uses a combination of EEG, fMRI, and psychophysics to investigate the neural mechanisms of consciousness, with a special emphasis on the contribution of decision-making, perception, working memory, and attention. And today he will tell us about very exciting new work showing how we can distinguish criterion from perceptual effects in consciousness research and why we might be overestimating the former in our current approaches. So Johannes, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot, Nadine, and thanks both you, Nadine, and Steve for inviting me. So it's great to be able to give this talk. So the title is Criterion Placement Threatens the Construct Validity of Subjective Measures of Consciousness. The first half of my talk will be about that criterion problem. And then I guess the second half, or a large part of the second half of the talk, will be about the effect of that on neural measures of consciousness and how that affects those. So I've actually given various parts of this talk previously at ACC. So maybe some parts will sort of ring a bell as I go through them. But I've never actually given this talk coherently as I do today here. So I always like to start introducing this topic with a little thought experiment, and I also use this thought experiment with students to explain to them the basics of signal detection theory. And what I want you to do is to imagine that you are in a room, a dark room. It's just a light on, it's you and me, and I'll be turning off the light, and then I'll ask you to detect a very faint stimulus, a very faint light that's appearing in the room, and your job is to just sort of press a button whenever you see the light coming on. So we'll do that little thought experiment. I'm turning off. Well, actually, it's a thought experiment in the sense that of course we're not collecting real data here, but I'm turning off the light, and now you'll see. Hopefully, you can see that every once in a while you see a very faint light appearing. Might not be as clear on every monitor, and your job is to detect this very faint light. Could be a bit dimmer every once in a while, and you might not always be sure about whether the light appeared or not. And I turn the light back on, and I say, "Well, you did pretty well. You got about 50% of the lights, but you also missed half of them. I'm not so happy about that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take your wallet, and whenever you miss a light, when we repeat this experiment, I'm going to take 100 euros out of your wallet. Now, maybe there's not that much money in your wallet, and we'll take it out of your bank account anyway. You'll lose it. And we'll repeat the exact same experiment with the same settings in the same room with the same light, but now under this instruction, because I just want you to detect all these lights. So repeat the experiment, turn the lights back off, and there we go again. Dim light every once in a while. And you might not be so sure of seeing it. And well, everybody can sort of predict what will happen. You'll probably be pretty anxious, and you'll probably have become very trigger happy, right? You want to detect those lights because it will cost you a lot of money to lose them. So having done this now, I could ask, will you, under these circumstances, consciously detect or perceive more lights in the second case? So, of course, you will detect more lights, but that you actually perceive them. So that's the question I'd like to ask of you, that you can ask yourself, but that we also asked the ASSC community at large. So we had exactly this scenario in there in this survey. I don't know whether you remember this when some of you may have been at ACC. There was a survey that we ran, I think, for 2 years, maybe even 3. It was definitely in Canada and the year after. And we asked this question, so I don't have to repeat all the details of the question, but the question is basically, do you detect more lights when you are in this more liberal, trigger-happy situation. Now, 67% of the people, consciousness researchers, and I shouldn't omit philosophers too, if they don't consider themselves researchers, anybody at ACC, I should say, believes that such a criterion shift in those years probably does not affect consciousness. There's also some people that do think it probably affects consciousness, but most people don't. But interestingly, actually, this question has never been very properly empirically addressed, right? So it's a question that most people have an intuition about, and that they think, well, given what I know about psychophysics and about STT and about how criterion shifts work, this doesn't seem like a perceptual shift. It seems more like a strategic shift to maximize my earnings or minimize my losses. But anybody who knows signal detection theory and understands these sort of tasks in a signal detection theoretic framework knows that this is modeled through what's called the criterion, and that the source of a criterion shift. So just to very quickly recap, there's two sort of measures that you take out of signal detection theory. One is sensitivity. Now, most people think that sensitivity approximates a change in experience, right? There can be fringe cases and blind sight and so forth, but at least the idea behind signal detection theory is that it sort of tracks what you perceive. And then there's the criterion, and the criterion can actually have different types of sources. So a criterion shift, where you shift your criterion, where you increase, for example, the number of hits, but also increase the number of false alarms. I didn't mention that, but that's important, that when you get trigger happy, you detect more lights, but you also more often press the button when there's actually no light there. And those sort of criterion shifts can have both a perceptual source or a decision bias or response bias source. Now, the question that we wanted to ask in our first set of experiments, and these were run by Nico, I should mention he's a PhD student now, becoming a postdoc in the next coming years in my lab at the VU. He ran these experiments, and we tried to dissociate these sort of sources. So what we did is we had three different manipulations, and incidentally, we tried to approach this problem first in a simpler version. So the example that I gave was a detection scenario where you actually have to detect something. And we also ran that experiment now, but I won't be talking about it today. But first, we did a simpler version where they're not actually doing detection, but where they're doing a categorization task. And we have criterion shifts just as you would in detection, but now in this categorization context. And how did we shift the criterion? So the task, I'll show on the next slide what the task looked like, but the basic idea in the task was that people had to decide whether a line was longer or shorter than a reference line. And we biased their criterion in three different ways. So one manipulation was what's called what we called sort of a perceptual manipulation, although the goal of the experiment was also to establish whether it was perceptual, but most people think of it as a perceptual effect, which is the Mueller-Lyer. So the Mueller-Lyer, if you have outward pointing lines, they are perceived as longer, and when they have inward pointing lines, they're perceived as shorter. So you can use that to sort of bias the criterion to saying long or to saying short. And the other two manipulations are more like the manipulation in the thought experiment. One was a base rate manipulation, where you have more long lines or more short lines. So in the base rate, you had 75 in the bias to long condition. 75% of the targets were actually longer than the reference line, 25% were shorter, and vice versa. In the bias to short. And what happens in those cases is, because there are more long lines, people are also inclined to start responding more often that something is long, more often than is warranted just by the ratio of the stimuli. So they also have this criterion shift. And in the PAVE manipulation, we did actually what we did in the thought experiment. We just started to punish people for the wrong response, saying, okay, hey, if you fail to detect a long line as long, we either punish you 5 instead of 1, or if you fail to detect a long line versus a short, we punish you 5. So you bias people in that way through a punishment scheme. So those were our 3 main manipulations. this was the task. So there was a reference line, and there was some explanation about how there was a lot of explanation before the experiment also about how all the manipulations worked, and they did practice and so forth. But what they had to do is they got a reference line, and then they would get a target screen, and they got a repeated target screens, and they had to decide every time, hey, is this target screen, is the line there longer or shorter than the reference line? And then we had two tasks, and that's critical for this experiment. We had the sort of standard task of people having to decide whether it's longer or shorter. So that's sort of a type 1 type response, a yes-no response in the context of detection, but here a short-long response. But we also had a second task, and that second task was aimed at determining whether the effect that the manipulation had, whether that effect was perceptual or not. And that task was to reproduce the actual length of the target line. So not to just decide whether the target line is longer or shorter than the reference, but to just reproduce whatever they just saw. And they would randomly get on every trial either a shorter, longer decision task or the reproduction task. So while viewing the trial, they wouldn't know which task they would get at the end. And then we had blocks with the Mueller-Lyer, blocks with the base rate condition, and blocks with the payoff condition. Oh, by the way, if things are unclear or if somebody has a question, I'm fine with you interrupting me so I can clarify if you want me to do that. So I hope everything is clear so far. Okay, so what the first question is, okay, do these manipulations work? Are they effective? Do they shift the criterion? So what you see here is the three manipulations: bias too long, bias too short, and then for the three types of manipulations, so Mueller-Lyer, base rate, and payoff. And what you see on the y-axis is the signal detection theoretic criterion, so the extent to which they move their criterion. And this is for the standard decision task that you would get. And what you see from these data is that, yeah, they're all in the case of bias too long, their criterion shifts in one direction, bias too short shifts in the other direction, and that happens for all three manipulations. And then to clarify, to show that a bit more clearly, here you see the actual differences. So this is basically the same three effects, but now shown as the subtraction of these two effects, so isolating the actual effect of the criterion manipulation. And you see that indeed the criterion is shifted for the Mueller-Lyer, for the base rate, and for the payoff, and actually least so for the Mueller-Lyer and most strongly so for the base rate for the payoff. Now the second question was, okay, but how does this affect perception? And that's an open question. Do we actually, so often people assume, at least 67% of the people at ASSC assume that these types of manipulations not involving something like the Mueller-Lyer are non-perceptual, but is that actually true? Because it's not entirely unimaginable that shifting your criterion also changes your percept in some way, right? That's the critical question here. And that actually turns out not to be the case. So here you see, in this graph, you see the result of the reproduction task. And what we plot on the y-axis here is the reproduction error. So how far off is their reproduction from the actual length of the reference line? And then you see that for bias too long, bias too short, again, for all three manipulations. And you see that for Mueller-Lyer, indeed, stimuli that are biased too long are actually reproduced as longer, and stimuli that are biased too short are reproduced as shorter. Whereas for the base rate and the payoff, that's not the case. They are just all reproduced as equally long, so the reproduction error is identical. If you take the differences again, as I did in the previous slide, you see a strong effect here for the Mueller-Lyer and no effect for the base rate and no effect for payoff. So that then establishes the sort of first question, which is a empirical question: to what extent are certain criterion shifts perceptual, and to what extent are they actually non-perceptual and just related to maximizing rewards or becoming better because incorporating the prior of a different base rate of targets to non-targets. Here's a summary of those results. So the decision task here on the left and the reproduction task on the right, and the plots that you saw before. Yeah, to be clear, most of these are non-perceptual, and then we did some to sort of, because we're now just eyeballing these figures. So you may ask yourself, hey, but can you sort of quantify that? We did some ordinal modeling for that, so that I'm not going into the details of that, but with the help of Julia Haaf, we ran some Bayesian ordinal models, and Bayesian ordinal models are just models that sort of specify a verbal relationship that you often use in hypotheses. So you, for example, say, hey, my hypothesis states that there is an effect for the Mueller-Lyer and there's no effect for base rate and payoff, or my hypothesis states that there's an effect for all three. And that way you can sort of quantify sort of verbal hypotheses in all sorts of different models. And that's what we did. And we ran those models on these two tasks. And then you see that the best model, the model that won, shows an effect of the criterion in all three conditions. But in the reproduction task, it selectively only shows an effect in the Mueller-Lyer and not in the other two tasks. Is all that clear so far? If not, let me know. Okay, so interim conclusions from that are that this reproduction measure that we used shows that you can have criterion shifts that affect your experience, right? As in the example of the Mueller-Lyer, and there are other examples out there where you can do things by combining cues. I'm not going to go into that for too long, but I think there's also a problem with how we frame those. So to talk about these as criterion effects, as we do in the context of signal detection theory, is, I think, not exactly the right phrasing. In fact, it's actually just a real perceptual effect. And the reason we call it criterion is that because we use the signal detection framework, and in that signal detection framework, we project a ground truth onto our participants about the actual length of the lines. But the participant, of course, cannot establish those actual lengths. It just has the line lengths on the retina, and he just has to infer those lengths, and that's just a regular perceptual process incorporating cues to establish length. But that's sort of maybe an aside, and I'll write something about that as well at some stage, but I just wanted to make that clear. But other things that we do think of as real criterion shifts, like payoff and base rate, they don't reflect they aren't a change in conscious experience. And then, yeah, the signal detection framework cannot really distinguish between those perceptual shifts, and we're not the first to show that. There's a paper by Witt et al. Also making that same point. But the point here is that that you cannot use that, and we use here the reproduction measure to be able to dissociate them. Yeah, Claire, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask you a little bit more, and just shut me up if you're going to cover it later, but why the reproduction is seen as the true measure of perception? Because, like, there's a raging debate as to the number of visual effects that might not filter through to the motor system. So, of course, you'll know about all this work in the Ebbinghaus illusion not affecting grip aperture. Of course, it's controversial, but meaning, so why is it not potentially a perceptual effect that doesn't touch the motor system?
Yeah, that's a valid question, Claire. I will give some corroborating evidence in the next couple of slides, but I cannot make that point for sure. It's one of the more tenacious, difficult points to address, because there's really no way of getting at it. It's the problem that we all have when we investigate consciousness, and I guess in a way also the point that I'm trying to make, that we can't really get there. So the best we can do is really to try to get there in sort of roundabout ways, so sort of things that seem intuitive, but this, somebody can always raise their hand and say, hey, whatever behavioral measure you're using here doesn't really reflect what you think it does. And I just have to admit that we're injecting here this as the best thing that we could come up with. And
do you think that there's anything better about the reproduction task, or is it just that one would hope, if it's perceptual, that it touches all of them?
Yes, it's the latter. I think one would hope that if it's perceptual, that you'd see that, and it would also not be clear to me why you wouldn't, right? I mean, I can see on the negative side that maybe you could reproduce something that's not there, that you didn't actually perceive, but to not reproducing something that was there, could be, but it's a quick task, right? So you see the stimulus, half a second later, go reproduce. If that doesn't get at it, I don't know how to fix it anymore, right? So Matthias, you also wanted to ask something.
Yeah, I was just a bit confused about the reproduction task for the payoff condition. I don't understand what it is that people are not biased anymore. Like, do they stop caring about money just because it's a reproduction task?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Matthias. And I've had this question before. I should have clarified this. So the tasks, the payoff is explicitly operating on the decision tasks. So they are told, hey, when you make a wrong decision, you'll get punished for it. But the reproduction, they're just told, hey, the reproduction, you get a general deduction for making incorrect reproductions. So we do say, hey, if your reproduction is off by more than 5 pixels, we'll subtract some money from you. But this is unrelated to the, or it doesn't incorporate this specific payoff condition of making a wrong decision. So it's a manipulation that's specific to the decision task.
You're saying that, okay, so it's symmetrical between reproducing the line as longer versus reproducing the line as shorter.
Exactly.
You don't. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then, yeah, it's less surprising that you don't see an asymmetry in the criterion then.
Absolutely. Yeah. True.
So do you think that your effect could be due to that rather than perceptual versus?
Well, I mean, to be clear, they're not getting feedback here on their incorrect reproductions for every single trial. And if they had truly seen those lines as longer, then they should reproduce them as longer, because they would be losing money otherwise, right? And you see that happening in the Müller-Lyer, because that's exactly the same thing going on there, right? In the Müller-Lyer, they also actually would earn more money if they had produced more faithfully, but they don't do that. And they are actually losing more money in that condition. But despite that, they're still reproducing as they should. Does that make sense? Okay. And then this sort of doesn't directly address your question, Claire, but it's sort of, I guess, yeah, hopefully it will give some supporting evidence for the idea that there are, Michael, you also want to ask something. I can't hear you.
Yes, it's also about the reproduction task in the criterion shift cases. If I read it correctly, there was a general, although there was not a difference due to the direction of payoff, there was a general underestimation, wasn't there, in all conditions?
Yeah, you also see general effects. That's true. You see that in all conditions, that you see general biases within so some subjects are biased. Yeah.
Okay, but following your logic, if you get an underestimation in the reproduction task, it's a conscious effect. So are you saying there's a conscious effect that everything is underestimated? That doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, what you see is like some noise around the mean, right? So on average, there is no, I guess are you talking about this?
Yeah, there's
this one, yes.
Yeah, they're below zero systematically.
Yeah. You see that both in the base rate and in the payoff, there is a general underestimation. So that's true, but it's not related to the criterion shift. No, so it does mean indeed. Sorry,
yeah. Can I press you?
Sure.
On your logic, that must be a perceptual effect.
On my logic, that has to be a perceptual effect. Yes, that's true. Yeah, on my logic, I can't deny that. Yeah, but the goal here is not to sort of claim that there are no perceptual effects ever in any circumstance. The goal here is to claim that there are criterion effects specifically that can occur in all various different contexts and due to all different kinds of reasons that are not perceptual. That is the goal. And then that poses a problem for, well, we'll get into that. Does that satisfy you? Yeah. Okay, thanks for asking for that clarification. Yeah, okay, so then a follow-up question is, are there other ways that signal detection theory to dissociate between shifts in experience? For example, drift diffusion models. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail explaining this because there's quite a bit of ground to cover, but as sort of an alternative to signal detection theory models, there are drift diffusion models. Drift diffusion models basically model the reaction time profile that people have in response to stimuli. And in those models, so what you see here is the sort of assumed evidence accumulation process underlying the decision, And then at some stage in this model, a boundary is crossed, and that is the reaction time. And those reaction times that you see here are basically plotted in a histogram, and then you do a fitting operation on those reaction time distributions, and you get out a bunch of parameters: the drift rate parameter, the drift criterion parameter, and the starting point parameter, some other parameters. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I just want to point out that these drift diffusion models have potentially two different mechanisms for estimating bias. So rather than in SDT, where you have just one criterion parameter, which is this one here, for those familiar with SDT, they recognize this. In drift diffusion modeling, you have two potential parameters that could reflect a bias. One is the drift criterion parameter, and that's whether the entire evidence accumulation process is shifted to one bound or shifted to the other bound. And the other is the starting point parameter, and that's whether the evidence accumulation process already starts at a certain point, so it's sort of lifted upwards. And these two bias parameters have, in the literature and in the past, been somewhat mixed results, been associated with either perceptual criterion shifts or non-perceptual criterion shifts. So the idea being that if you have a drift criterion shift, so a criterion shift due to the drift criterion parameter, or sometimes called drift bias parameter, that involves a change in the evidence accumulation process, and that is then assumed to be something reflecting perception itself, or when you are just pushed to sort of change your sort of the amount of evidence that you require to give a certain response. So basically a change in starting point, those are sometimes thought to reflect non-perceptual criterion shifts. This also worked by White, but also many others. So we looked at that in the context. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in the context of exactly this experiment. So we had a bunch of experiments doing the same task, and in the experiments that we did, we couldn't collect reaction times. So here we had, because of the fact that we had these two tasks, so we basically repeated the same experiment, but with only the decision task, to see whether we could get out different drift diffusion model parameters for these different type of tasks. So that's what you see here. These are already the differences between bias too long and bias too short. For green, which is the Mueller-Lyer, red, which is the base rate, and blue, which is the payoff. And what you see there is indeed that you get a different drift diffusion parameter profile, meaning that there is a larger drift criterion parameter for the Mueller-Lyer compared to the other conditions. And then there is a higher starting point parameter estimate for the other conditions compared to the Mueller-Lyer. But these models don't allow you to just simply use those parameters and slap on a label of this is perceptual or this is non-perceptual. And the reason for that is that when you just take the outcome of any single experiment without comparing them to each other, then the results are not informative, because there's also drift criterion effects here in the base rate and in the payoff condition. So you see that the estimate is 0.5. So then, yeah, if you just would have one experiment, it wouldn't be clear on what basis you would now say, hey, when do we say it's perceptual or non-perceptual? So it just doesn't speak directly to that question. But you can say that if you have multiple manipulations and you start comparing them to each other, as we did here, that you can say, hey, this is more likely to be perceptual, because here we see the highest effect of the drift criterion compared to the other ones. And here we see the lowest effect of starting point compared to the other ones. Does that make sense? So, but it's not informative directly with respect to the question, but it does maybe speak indirectly to your question, Claire, saying, hey, there's some circumstantial evidence to suggest, hey, there is something different going on here in these cases than just by the reproduction measure alone, right? So this just gives some extra evidence to suggest that. So continuing my interim conclusions, the drift diffusion modeling results confirm that there's these different profiles, but you cannot really distinguish at the level of a single experiment whether something is perceptual or non-perceptual. And this is, yeah, I'm already at the end of this little part, but there's much more. So hopefully I can fit it on in 1 hour. So we have this out as a preprint, everything that I talked about so far, and it's also currently in press at PNAS. So super happy that this is this has landed there, and it should come out in I guess 2 or 3 weeks. So you can look it up either as a preprint or hopefully soon at PNAS itself. Yeah, then we come back to this question that we started with, which is, will you consciously perceive more lights under a criterion shift? And that most people say no. And I think, well, at least to me, these experiments provide extra evidence to support the conclusion that these type of criterion shifts involving payoff don't involve a change in perception. It's not perfect, right? There is no perfect, and it's not a detection context. So we, as I said, we also have that, but that's for later. But at least all these things point in the direction that there are just decisions that optimize your rewards, and that result you to, or that cause you to indicate that you see something more often without actually seeing something more often, right? And that is a problem. And that's, I will, my thesis is that is a much bigger problem for subjective measures of consciousness than is generally admitted. So why is that important for neural measures of consciousness? Okay, first let's start with the behavior. So there's different ways in which people assess consciousness. So one set of behavioral measures are the objective measures. Those just do D prime. So how well can a subject identify something or not? They have their own set of problems associated with them. I briefly touched on those in the beginning. Things like blind sight. Is it really, if somebody is at a D prime of 0, yeah, presumably they don't see it, but maybe it's a too conservative estimate. You're also putting, again, some sort of, as I explained, somewhere along halfway, that it also puts some sort of gold standard of seeing. You're imposing a sort of reality onto your participant when you use these sort of measures. So there's these sets of problems, but they don't suffer from the problems that I outlined with the criterion, because you have D prime, and D prime is in principle independent from criterion. Regardless of what your criterion is, your D prime should be approximately the same. There's a little bit to, if you look at these experiments where you push around to criterion, you will typically also see small D prime effects, as there were in the experiments that I already talked about, but they are typically very marginal compared to the criterion effects. So objective measures, I wouldn't say all fine. They have their own sets of problems. Maybe I'll get into that later on in later experiments, but let's ignore them for now. I'll talk now in the rest of the talk about subjective measures. What happens in subjective measures is quite different. There you don't do a manipulation where you say, hey, this is my conscious condition and this is my unconscious condition. And here very strong masking, and people can't detect that D prime is 0. And here I don't have strong masking there at 100%. You don't do any of that. You say, hey, I have one sort of visibility level, and I titrate my visibility to, for example, 75% correct or something like that. And then I have the people in my experiment just press a button whenever they see it and whenever they don't. So they press unseen for some trials and seen for other trials. And then I post hoc sort, and post hoc means after the experiment, I sort my conditions into seen and unseen, or conscious and unconscious. And yeah, some of these experiments try to be somewhat straight about it by talking about seen and unseen, but everybody thinks while they're reading them, this is the conscious condition, this is the unconscious condition. And now the question is, okay, what happens in these conditions when you have these criterion problems that are not related to changes in perception? That is basically the question that I want to get into here. By the way, why do people do this? There's a bunch of reasons, but the two most important arguments that you hear over and over again is, one, that they are better experiments than experiments using some manipulation, because we are used in psychology and neuroscience to manipulate stuff because you have experimental control. So this is a strange thing, right? You basically transfer your control as the experimenter over to your participant, because you say, hey, you are the one that has now all the information that I need about my conditions. And they say, well, this is a good idea because now we're keeping physical stimulation identical. And that means that anything I measure in terms of differences between my conditions should be related to the difference between conscious and unconscious, for example. So that's one argument. And the other argument is because it takes consciousness seriously. It asks for a subjective assessment of what you saw, and you use that now in your analysis. And we'll see whether that's a good idea. Okay, so the subjective measures framework does this and says, okay, seen is conscious, unseen is unconscious, and the sort of shift in this direction is just a change in conscious experience. That's all fine. The SDT framework takes a different, signal detection theory framework takes a different sort of look on this, right? Because it says, hey, you have a decision here, and that decision basically reflects the criterion, and the criterion can be due to different reasons, and that's what the first half of my talk was about, that there is these reasons don't need to be perceptual. It could be decision bias and response bias. And yeah, I would say that actually most of these criterion shifts are not influences on conscious perception, right? At least as how we conceptualize them, these criterion shifts. So what would you predict about the neural measures of consciousness, or the NCC, or whatever you want to call it, within a subjective measures framework? So if you take subjective measures seriously, then regardless of what the criterion of the participant is, this is what your prediction would be, because you would say, hey, these unseen targets here, regardless of whether you give those unseen responses in a liberal or in a conservative framework, I'm taking your response seriously. You say unseen, that means you had no experience, and that means that I should have very little neural processing related to your experience, and it should in principle be identical between these two conditions. And the same for the seen targets. You shouldn't see a large difference between seen targets in a conservative versus in a liberal detection framework, regardless of your criterion. That's basically the idea behind subjective measures. If you take SDT seriously and you try to make the same predictions in the context of the SDT framework, you get very different predictions, because they say, hey, you have a conservative criterion or a liberal criterion. And that really changes a lot. So if I select here, it changes the signal strength a lot. So if I take all the unseen trials under a conservative criterion, those on average are going to have a higher signal strength than unseen trials under a liberal criterion. And relatedly, also for the seen trials, the average signal strength, so this black dot here sort of tries to pinpoint the approximate average of all these signals that you get here. So on the x-axis you have signal strength. The average signal strength for these seen trials here is larger than the in the conservative condition than the average signal strength of the seen trials in the liberal condition, right? So the predictions, somewhat counterintuitively, are quite different in an SDT framework for conservative versus liberal. And actually what you would predict, and that's also counterintuitive, I think, to many consciousness researchers, is that if you put somebody in a conservative mode, so you say, hey, I want you to be really certain when you indicate that you saw something. You have to be conservative, because I don't want to make my data noisy by including all sorts of things that you weren't really sure about. That sounds like a plausible sort of verbal thing to say, right? But if you look at the predictions that instruction would result in, that would be the result of that instruction in terms of the predictions in the signal strength and the neural measures that you get, is that a conservative person will have a stronger signal for both seen targets and a stronger signal for unseen targets in the conservative case versus the liberal case. Is that clear for everybody? Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, one thing I'd just like to clarify, the x-axis on these signal detection things, in signal detection theory, that's an internal signal. It's really important to distinguish that from the external signal, which isn't actually represented on this plot.
Yes.
So when you talk about signal strength and you go over to your bar graphs, you're not, I assume, making that confusion. You're not, signal strength is not the external signal strength in this.
Exactly.
Yeah,
No.
okay, fine.
It's the internal signal strength. So the only assumption I'm making here, which is reasonable, and I actually should prove it to be true, is that the internal signal strength is also reflected when you try to measure it, for example, through fMRI or EEG, in a stronger EEG signal or a stronger bolt response. So you will actually get a stronger NCC out of that. So, but a good thanks for asking. That's a good clarification. So we have competing predictions here, and yeah, I'm sort of well, anyway, I've explained this. If you take really the subjective measures framework seriously, and you think or you assume that you can really identify the NCC through the subjective measures framework, then this would be your prediction. And you would need to do some work to get this out. If you take the SDT framework seriously, this is what you should get. So I hope that's clear for everybody. And now we're actually going to look at what happens when you do this. So what we did here is we actually did an equivalent of the light detection experiment that I started the talk with. But here, rather than a light, we have a figure ground stimulus. So people that know my work or my background know that I've used many of these stimuli in the past. They are sort of a remnant from doing experiments in monkeys by my promoter. But basically, what we did in this experiment, by the way, was done by Niels Kloosterman when he was still a master's student in our lab a long time ago. What we did here is we just had a sequence of textures, and in that sequence, somewhere halfway through, there could appear either a square or no square, and the subject was asked to detect the square. So they just had to press a button whenever they saw the square, and this sequence would just continue. It would just be a continuous stream of textures going bang, 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 and every once in a while. And so the appearance of the square is basically the equivalent of the light that would appear in the dark room, because it's not easy to detect in this sequence of squares, and you'll miss quite a few when you try to do this task. And then we slapped on this instruction where we said, hey, if you miss one, either we punish you, or if you press one when no square was present, we'll punish you. So that was basically our criterion manipulation to affect the first order decisions about whether the square was there. But the instruction to the participant was just like, hey, press a button when you see the square. Do your best. Now, first, the behavior. So the behavior is exactly as you would expect. So you see that the hit rate in the liberal condition goes up, but the false alarm rate in the liberal condition also goes up. Exactly what you would expect, or vice versa. The hit rate goes down and the false alarm rate goes down for the conservative. The sensitivity didn't change much. So you can quantify sensitivity in various ways, either hit rate minus false alarm rate. That's sort of a crude approximation. If you do it properly in SDT, you take the Z-transform of the hit rate and you subtract the Z-transform of the false alarm rate, the Z-score, I should say, sorry. And then you get D prime. Well, when you do that, you get a small sensitivity effect. But as I explained before, those sensitivity effects are super minor compared to the huge criterion effect that you get. So you get strong criterion effect and little effect on sensitivity. Then the neural measures. But before I get to the neural measures, I'll first treat a little criticism, because people might say, well, hey, this yes/no response, that's not really getting at what we want to get at. We have a better thing now, and it's called the perceptual awareness scale, because the perceptual awareness scale is much more fine-grained, and it can actually allow you to indicate exactly what you experienced, much more than this yes/no response, which of course is sensitive to criterion effects. But let's switch to that. So that of course has been introduced. This is what, for those that don't know, this is what the perceptual awareness scale looks like. It allows you to give sort of a quantify your subjective experience in terms of these verbal descriptions like no experience, belief, glimpse, almost clear experience, or clear experience. So to address those concerns, we ran the same experiment using this PAS. And the implicit assumption in the PAS is, of course, because the PAS has more of this fine-grained response, it isn't sensitive to these criterion shifts. And of course, yeah, you have to then put labels on these things. So no experience is unseen, all the other ones is seen. Problem with the PAS is also that you can make these, you can divide these up in different ways, right? You could also say like, well, I think that the real threshold for consciousness is between brief glimpse and almost clear. So we'll just divide things up in a different way, depending on what my data look like. That's not a good idea either, but if you would be strict about how you use the PAS, this would be how you use it. Unseen is no experience, and the rest is seen at least something, a conservative way of thinking. So we did the same task again, also collected EEG with that task. And now we gave an explicit task instruction. It's very important that you keep responding according to what you actually experience using the perceptual awareness scale, blah, blah, blah. And then we use the same manipulation to sort of push around their criterion. Behavior of that actually shows that there's a strong criterion shift at all levels of the PAS. So you see that, as you saw for the yes/no task, that in all 3 levels of the PAS, people become more lower their sort of hit rate in the conservative condition, but they also lower their false alarm rate and vice versa. So there you see that at least in this type of task, people are not able to maintain a stable criterion within the PAS. And they shift around their PAS responses depending on the criterion manipulation. So what about the NCC? That's what we really wanted to know. So these are the predictions that I made for the NCC. What did we do? So we had EEG with this task, and what we tried to do is we have a figure and a no figure in the task, and we decode from the EEG the presence of the figure. So it's basically just the decoding equivalent in the brain for what the participant was trying to do. So now we just try to decode figures from no figures using brain data. Here you see for experiment 1 and experiment 2 the overall decoding accuracy. So the green one is experiment 1, the yellow one is experiment 2, the black one is the average of the two. You can see that there's a huge difference in decoding accuracy, and there's multiple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that we just have way more data for experiment 1, so 3 sessions instead of 2. So you just get much more data to train on. So it's not really meaningful to interpret these accuracies because they're just driven by different signal-to-noise ratios. But what we do see is that in both experiments, despite that they were collected, the data was collected, I think, more than 10 years apart, because the data from experiment 1 is really old. It's already published twice in eLife. The experiment 2 was collected much later by Philippa. I didn't even mention Philippa, but she collected the data. She's now a master's student. She's now a postdoc in the lab of Anne Oerai in Leiden. And you see that the overall sort of patterns related to processing figures from no figures is the same. This is sort of a data pattern that I've shown many times in past experiments. And yeah, you always see these sort of 3 sort of peaks, sort of an early peak in decoding that we often relate to feed forward. It probably also incorporates some lateral and some feedback, but it's mostly feed forward, and you get massive recurrent in-sensory cortices, which is around 260 milliseconds. And then you get a later response around 430, which is reflecting, you could say, P3, global ignition, all those type of things. So really a report attention related type of signal. So what we then did is, I already said this. So what we then did is then sort of split up our data into these 3 peaks just to make it manageable to look at this. And then we compared the liberal and the conservative decoding after post hoc sorting trials into seen and unseen. And to be clear, when we did that, we did all sorts of controls, making sure that the trial numbers are the same, or using all trials. None of it really matters. You just get, when you look at the data, at least in the unseen condition, very clearly higher decoding in late stages. So the early stage between liberal and conservative is more or less the same, and then you get much stronger decoding in the unseen conservative than in the unseen liberal, in the early sensory decoding, and also in the late decoding. You see also glimpses of that in the seen. but not as strong. I'll get back to that later. So that's a bit, is actually, I think, something that can quite easily be explained. Then for experiment 2, the PAS experiment, we see something similar. So you see that the effect is actually not very strong in unseen, if it's there at all, but very strong in the PAS 1, both in intermediate and in late, and also in the PAS 2, maybe a bit less strong, but also there, and in the PAS 3, again, a bit less strong, but it's also there. So, but here it's important to point out indeed that here the effect seems to be more on the seen trials than on the unseen trials, but I'll get back to that. The main point that I want to make here is that exactly as SDT would predict, you get much stronger decoding in the conservative condition than in the liberal condition. And yeah, this is easily explained by the fact that you're post-hoc sorting your trials on high signal trials for conservative and on low signal trials for liberal. So that's why you get this. So here's a plot of the 2 experiments where we collapsed across seen and unseen, because the prediction was also a main main effect prediction that would hold for all the data together. So here you see it even stronger, but there are strong criterion effects in experiment 1 for all these late signals, and also in experiment 2. So I would say that is clearly in favor of the SDT prediction, that what we're seeing here is just something that is the direct result of the criterion operating on the signal strength that you're post-hoc sorting on, which is not a good idea. Then, of course, people might also object, say like, hey, but are these effects really due to post-hoc sorting? Or is it maybe the case that in the conservative condition, overall decoding is better? That's a valid concern to have. So here we have the same decoding data, but now without post-hoc sorting. So we just take all the trials in the liberal condition and all the trials in the conservative condition, both in experiment 1 and in experiment 2. And then you see that there's actually no difference in decoding accuracy in any of the time points in any of the conditions.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused by this, Johannes, because your prediction was that conservative was always going to be higher for both seen and unseen, right? So why
under post-hoc sorting? So here we didn't do any post-hoc sorting. Here we just take all the trials. If you go back to this plot, maybe this plot. So here we just take all trials. So there's no splitting up between seen and unseen. We're just decoding all the figure trials against all the no figure trials. And here against all the figure trials, against all the no figure trials. And then you expect no difference. You just get a brain equivalent of sensitivity, right? So the thing that, and that's just to show that because it is conceivable that the conservative condition also has an effect on D prime or something like that. They are small effects, but it's very marginal. Yeah, so that's the control of that. Okay. And then just the thing that I pointed out before, a bit of the odd thing, and that's the fact that we see quite strong effects here in unseen, and here we see strong effects in seen. And people might wonder, well, that all looks a bit sloppy. Why is that? Why do you see things in unseen? That's not what you predicted. You said you'd see effects both in seen and in unseen. And now I'm going to go back and say, hey, my initial prediction was a bit too simple, because we went back to a simulation and then simulated things a bit, and then looked at what happened to the effect of criterion shifts, either in different sensitivity contexts or in different overall criterion contexts. So here we have the sensitivity context changing. So we have the same criterion. So this is a simulation of data. So these are just trials that we simulate, and then we just post-hoc sort these trials and then compute a AUC equivalent based on those trials. And if your overall sensitivity is low, as in this example, and you have these criteria, then you see that the effect of a criterion shift, which then sits on this tail of the signal distribution, is strongest in seen. But if the same criteria are applied in a much higher sensitivity context, so in which the signal distribution is shifted way more to the right, then the same two criteria, a shift in the same two criteria from liberal to conservative, result in a much bigger effect on unseen. Similarly, if you look at the same sensitivity situations. So you compare two situations in which the sensitivity is actually the same, but you look at overall criterion. So here the overall criterion of the participant is conservative. So we have a shift at the conservative end. Then you see again that the effect is mostly unseen. Whereas if the overall criterion is liberal in the same sensitivity context, you get an effect on unseen. So this is highly problematic, I would say. And I think you see this all over the place, where people do all these different types of experiments where the sensitivity is different. Sometimes we do the high signal trials together with the low signal trials. Sometimes we separate them out and so forth. So criticism, again, to come back to that same criticism, that people might say, well, people are not subjected to reward schemes. This is all very superficial. If you do, or artificial, if you do this in a true consciousness experiment, this wouldn't play a role. If you know anything about psychophysics and about detection tasks and so forth, you know that these criterion shifts happen all over the place due to these types of things. So if you just include more high visible targets into your experiment, you're going to get a criterion effect. If you mix high visible, or if you just change the sensitivity overall in your experiment, so you're investigating like highly visible targets, and that you're going to get sensitivity effects that directly play into these type of effects when you do post-hoc sorting on seen and unseen. So there's many reasons why you get criterion effects. These are very clear ones. Things like base rate, of course. So payoff was one example, but base rate is another. If I just include more targets in there, that's also going to shift your criterion around. Also, just to state that the subject, if they're excited or dull, the instructions that you give them, I want you to be sure that you didn't see it. That plain instruction can affect things, individual differences, and so forth and so forth. So it's a huge difference, huge problem, I would say, for any subjective measure of consciousness, how you deal with these criterion shifts. Right. So my thesis is a bit strong, maybe a bit stern. I hope to be friendly, but I do think that these non-perceptual criterion shifts deeply confound neural measures of consciousness that are established contingent on this post-hoc sorting approaches on subjective measures. I'm not going to call out any particular experiments or data points, but there are, I think, quite a few. There's also many that don't do that. They use objective measures or they combine them, but you have to be very critical about what's going on exactly in those experiments. And this is true for both these type 1, type 2 responses, but also when you use these more fine-grained measures like the PAS. Now, I have to look to you, Nadine. Yeah, I'll get to your question as well, but also I have to look to Steve, because these are interim conclusions. I have one more part to my talk, which will take, I guess, another 10 minutes. So I'm not sure whether we can accommodate that or whether you'd rather go into questions, because the talk could end here just fine. But I can also do the final bit.
I don't know, Steve. I think it'd be nice if you do the like, we still have half an hour. So if you do 10 minutes, we would still have 20 minutes for questions. So
yeah, I agree.
Okay. Then let's get to the question first, Nadine. You had a question.
Oh yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was wondering, so you say this is a problem, but ultimately the comparison between seen and unseen, the relative difference is still going to be informative, right? Even under both a low or a high criterion, decision criterion, you still expect that the underlying neural signal between seen and unseen, the difference tells you something interesting about differences in degree of conscious awareness, right?
No, not really. That's entirely contingent on whether that criterion shift is related to consciousness. If that criterion shift is unrelated to consciousness, as I tried to point out in the first half, that there are all these criterion shifts that are unrelated to consciousness, then it's just a massive confound. It's just a confound unrelated to consciousness.
Sorry, I think I'm confused here, because so where you set your criterion is dependent on many things that have nothing to do with conscious experience. I get that, but once you set your criterion, saying something is seen versus unseen will also be indicative of a difference in conscious experience, right? So even in all of your under liberal and under conservative plots, the signal strength between seen and unseen was still different, and it was just a shift. Like when you were conservative, it was here, and when you were liberal, it was here, or something like that. But the difference between those two.
Yeah, but let's be very clear about what that difference shows. That difference shows a difference in signal strength.
Yes.
But that difference in signal strength is not doesn't map onto the supposed change in conscious perception, right? So just okay, to go back to the first example of somebody in a dark room,
Yes.
we all agreed that in that dark room nothing changed. But now I'm going to do this experiment again, and I'm going to take these measures and these
So-
neural measures, and I get very different
Yeah, so you get different
neural
ratios.
measures, NCCs in one and NCCs in the others.
Well, no, you get different ratios of reports of seen and unseen. So if you have a conservative setting, you're going to be less or like more likely to, or less likely to say yes. But on average, when you say yes, you're still going to have a more vivid conscious experience than when you say no.
Yes, but that is
Yes.
not reflected in your NCC. Your NCC is not reflecting of that. I mean, the NCC that you get out is not sort of a yeah, it reflects an increase in signal strength, but it's not a neat. Okay, let me put it this way: we
Yes,
both
it's-
agree
yeah,
that
it's
we
not
both
neat,
agree that in
but it's
both
still
experiments, we in both experiments, the experience was the same, but
Mhm.
from the second experiment, I get a much higher signal strength, both in the unseen and in the seen. So apparently they were both more conscious and more unconscious in the conservative experiment.
No. So I think
What?
the thing that I'm saying is that the difference between the two is still going to be informative. So either on your conservative or on your liberal situation, there's going to be more signal in the seen compared to the unseen. And if that's in the same brain area, that still says that probably that brain area says something about your conscious experience, right? So
That
it's not
is all
like
fine.
it's all nonsense. It's just that it's a
That-
bit
well,
biased.
That all, well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think that all depends on your theoretical framework. And I said I wouldn't call out any things, but let's talk about unconscious working memory. Does it exist or does it not?
No, I
To
think
give one example. Why do you think it doesn't exist?
I think I'm with you on that whole
Yeah, but it's
situation.
exactly
But-
this issue. It's exactly this issue. It's exactly this issue of stating, hey, these unconscious things are like, yeah, why do they get unconscious working memory? Just because the criterion was set in such a way that you get still functional aspects of working memory, despite the participants saying no, because that's just better in their whatever experimental context in which they were operating.
Okay. I don't want to like now.
No, but
take all the spotlight
it's good
attention
to-
on this. This was
No, no.
very interesting. Steve, do you want to go and ask? the
Yeah,
question?
Steve, you want to?
Yeah, no, I can see there's a few hands, but Nadina, you're in charge, so depending on whether we want to.
You were the first hand, so I'm just
No, I just mean in terms of like whether Johannes wants to carry on the next part and then we do questions, or.
yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure because it is kind of nice to just let the discussion flow as it unfolds. I don't know, Johannes, do you have a strong preference to?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that probably people have a lot of questions. I see 4 hands. And I think it's nice to go over all those discussion points. So maybe it's better if I just finish up. So then we have all the time left to discuss all that. If that's okay.
If you have a bit of time, then you
with-
can go for it. Yeah,
That's
okay, great.
good. Let's do that.
Is that okay
Yeah.
with all of you?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Go for
So
it.
please, for the people raising their hands, can you please keep your question in mind, and then we'll get back to it. So then just to as a last bit, what about confidence as a measure to dissociate perceptual from non-perceptual criterion shifts? That sort of goes back to the beginning, and I put it all the way at the end because yeah, I sort of for the flow of the talk. So there was a paper by Gallagher saying that you could use confidence as a diagnostic tool for perceptual after effects. So what they basically did is they had people undergo adaptation. So there was a coherent motion in a certain direction in the visual field, and you get adaptation, and then you see sort of a movement of motion after that in the opposite direction. And they had 2 conditions: either there was coherent motion or there was random motion, and then they would cue a certain direction. And then they had participants do a decision task similar to the tasks that I talked about in the beginning. You just make a first order decision, and then they also had to express confidence in that decision. And what they showed was that when you do this manipulation, you get a shift in the psychometric curve. So when you adapt more in one direction, then you also get the situation that you see everything more in the opposite direction, and vice versa. But also the cueing had an effect. They were explicitly instructed to, when they were uncertain about the direction of motion, that they had to default to the cued direction. So that also results in a shift. And then they asked for confidence, and then they plotted the confidence curve that was associated with that. And then you see that when people are, so here on the y-axis you have uncertainty. So a low point here means that they are very uncertain, because it's going from 0 to minus 0 to 1, but in negative direction. Don't know why they plotted it this way, but that's what they did. And what you see is that when people are very uncertain here, so that's the middle of the psychometric curve, then they are also most unsure here. And when they are very uncertain here, then they are also most uncertain in their confidence ratings here. So there the confidence scales, or the confidence curve, reflects their perception in a sense. And they also did that for the queued task, but there this didn't happen. And the reason for that is obvious. That's because they queued the participants. So there's really nothing that could result in their uncertainty being lowest. This is just this manipulation primarily affects their first order response, right? And then they were just uncertain all around, and it didn't shift their response curve. And based on this, they claimed our findings show that subjective confidence, when measured in addition to perceptual decisions, can supply important diagnostic information about the cause of after effects. So we thought this was interesting, and we thought, well, maybe we can apply it in our task that we already have. So I don't have to explain all this again. It's just the same thing that I explained in the beginning. And then what we added was just the confidence rating to see what happens. And these are the, now we plot everything the way Gallagher did. So things are plotted a bit differently than we did in the beginning. And that's just to be able to nicely map it onto their study. What you see is here on the x-axis, you have different line lengths. And here on the y-axis, now you have probability of answering long. And you see that all the three manipulations have a clear effect on the shift of the psychometric curve towards long for one manipulation and towards short for the other, and that for all three manipulations. So that's basically just the equivalent of the criterion effect plotted in a different way. Then we had the reproduction task. So that was all identical as in the same in the previous experiment. Now we plot the reproduction as also for these different line lengths, because we had, of course, all the different line lengths in the experiment. And then you see that there's in reproduction, replicating our initial result, no effect for the base rate. So basically, they're all reproduced equally long, a strong effect for Mueller-Lyer, and no effect for payoff. And that's all nice. And then the core question was, of course, what happens to confidence? And then you see actually that also in confidence, there is a shift in the confidence. So the lowest point of the confidence curve for all three manipulations. So here you see the lowest point for the Mueller-Lyer, for bias to long, and for bias to short. And you actually see that despite the fact that the payoff and the base rate condition are supposed to be a non-perceptual, at least from all the reproduction task measurements, a non-perceptual effect, you still see shifts in confidence. And that's not entirely surprising, especially for the base rate. It's not such a surprise, because the base rate also gives you an overall prior, right? So the overall prior then also informs your confidence. So it's not so weird. It was actually weird that Gallagher would predict that that wouldn't happen, right? So that you get for the payoff, it's a bit more surprising, but there's other experiments also showing these effects of payoff on confidence shifts. So even though the payoff is not informative, you still apparently let that reward information seep into your confidence judgment. And then we asked, okay, well, maybe it's due because to the fact that we had delayed confidence, that maybe the delayed confidence basically informs the first decision informs your confidence judgment. So we said, okay, well, let's try it with concurrent confidence, where you just have one decision that both incorporates whether you are confident or not, pressing with left or right finger, or whether your decision is long or short. And this basically just replicated the same result. So everything was replicated and you get the same outcome. So this is also a preprint. It's submitted, and we're hoping that it goes into review. That would be really nice. So just some final conclusions. I think that these perceptual criterion shifts confound neural measures of consciousness, at least when you interpret them in a simple way. So I can see what Nadine says, that of course, it doesn't have to be completely uninformative, but if you just take them at face value, this is my unconscious condition and this is my conscious condition, without an SDT framework trying to understand what's really going on, then they are, I would say, confounded. And disentangling perceptual from non-perceptual shifts is important, but I would say in practice, very difficult, if not impossible. If I go with Claire, I would say impossible. But in practice, I would say, insofar as we tried, very difficult. At least I would say that controlled reproduction trumps these decision-based metrics, such as these first-order judgments, SDT, and distribution modeling from the data that we have, but you can always object, and also confidence ratings. We had a bit of discussion with Stephen about this as well. That doesn't mean that the derivative of confidence ratings like metacognition and so forth are not informative, but if you just take the confidence ratings themselves, or the PAS, by the way, I didn't even mention the PAS, then they are also sensitive to these non-perceptual criterion shifts. And I would like to thank all these people. I didn't mention all of them, but particularly Nico, because he collected all the data for the first and the confidence experiment, Niels collecting the data for the detection experiment, and Philippa, and also thanking Simon and Steve and Julia and Timo for being involved in all these projects and helping me think and getting it all working.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Johannes. Let's all unmute and give Johannes a round of applause.